Hello and welcome to CGTN special program on the fallout of the Iraq War, 20 years after the invasion led by the United States and its allies. I'm Li Chuyan in Beijing. Coming up, 2 decades on from the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, we look at the bitter legacy left on the country and its people in our special program, Iraq War 20 years on.
There's no debate.
A former UK government official shares her thoughts on the country's involvement in the Iraq War based on false intelligence of weapons of mass destruction.
So lies, breaches of international law, terrible destruction, but shame on the government.
Plus, we discuss Iraq's gradual reconstruction and the efforts being made by international organizations. It's been 20 years since the United States and its allies began their invasion of Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of civilians and soldiers from both sides died in a brutal 9-year conflict. Washington claimed to possess intelligence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which later proved inaccurate. The decision caused a chain of events that are still playing out to this day. And in today's program, we want to ask how much has Iraq recovered after 2 decades? And has enough reflection been done to avoid further bloodshed? We'll speak to our reporters in Iraq, my colleagues in London and Washington, D.C., and experts on the Middle East. Let's begin with our correspondent Owen Holdaway. He's joining me live from Mosul. Thank you for joining us this hour, Owen. Iraq's second biggest city, Mosul, was once a center for culture and trade in the region, but the city was devastated by the conflict. What impact did the war have on Iraq's economy and culture?
I mean, here in the north, it particularly devastated the area. This city was a pre-war population before the 2 million. A lot of the people who lived here have been decimated. They've been in refugee camps. The economy here is still very much recovering from the war against the Islamic State, which happened from 2016 to 2017. In general, as well, the area of northern Iraq and the whole area of Nineveh and these areas were very much marginalised when the fall of the Ba'athist regime, because they very much lost their power base. There has been some form of economic reconstruction and some sort of reparations and some reconstruction, but the situation here still is still very much economically marginalised, and there's still a lot of rebuilding that needs to go on, particularly in some of the areas of the city centre and around the old quarter that were particularly heavily destroyed during the war against the so-called Islamic State.
20 years have passed since the war broke out. What more can you tell us about the progress being made regarding post-war reconstruction across the country?
It's a mixed picture. Here in Mosul, like I said, there's been some reconstruction work that's been done. The airport, for instance, is being rebuilt, which was heavily destroyed during the war against the Islamic State. But there's other areas where there is a real need of reconstruction. I think the area that is quite sad, that's really taken a hit since the fall of the Ba'athist regime, is the archaeological and the site. A lot of archaeological and deep historic sites that were really destroyed, and some of these treasures really cannot be replaced. Sites like Nimrod and Hatra here in the north, although there is being some form of rebuilding there, a lot of these ruins, they really can't be replaced, and they really have that history has really been lost since the fall of the Ba'athist regime. So the picture generally is sort of a mixed picture in terms of reconstruction. There is some money that is getting through, but it's very sporadic. But I think the real take-home message is the fact of the archaeological and the historical loss which is irreplaceable for Iraq.
Owen, thank you very much for that. Owen Holdaway joining me live from Mosul. Appreciate it. I now want to bring in Laith Al-Hadari in the Iraqi capital of Baghdad. Good to see you there, Laith. How is the city doing 20 years after war where you are?
Yes, well, actually, Baghdad is more stable now than before. The invasion have left lots of casualties through the pollution of using certain types of bombing, and also the infrastructure have suffered a lot. Now, still, Iraq trying to overcome the problem, but it seems it's hard for the successive government, even the recent one, to overcome the problem due to the funds and the corruption that it takes place in this country. Now, the Prime Minister, Mr. Mohammed Shia Sudani, have announced a couple of sets of promises in order to achieve a better infrastructure for the future: hospitals, housings, schools, and even better roads for the big masses of people. You know, the problem is still like we are facing it, but we don't see on the ground any work on the ground. But we have to give Mr. Shia Sudani the time to implement his promises.
Now, what are the long-term impacts of the war, especially on the lives of the people there? What are you seeing?
Well, as I said, you know, lots of problems that Iraq is still suffering since the invasion, like, you know, the pollution, the corruption, the drug dealing, the system that runs the country, which is based on the sharing method, which makes everyone not accountable for any mistakes they're doing. So that's why the political parties are outside of any accountable from any mistakes that happens through these 20 years. Lots of money is being spent for the infrastructure, but the infrastructure is still the same. We haven't seen anything like real work happened for the Iraqi people. But let's hope, as I said, for this recent government to do their promises. They trying to find a solution for the long number of graduates to seek better jobs, better lives, and also for a better education, better health care. All that needs lots of money. We know that Iraq is out of, you know, a productive country. They're all, you know, it's a consuming country now, based on only oil trade, which makes them like slaves for the international monetary funds.
An arduous task there to rebuild the cities. Thank you very much for bringing us that. Lais Al-Hadari joining me from Baghdad. Appreciate it. And now to the United States, which is itself still politically divided over the war. To find out what lessons have been learned from the invasion, my colleague Asiye Namdar is joining me now from Washington.
Hello, everyone. I'm Asiye Namdar from our studio here in Washington, D.C. 20 years ago this week, the U.S. launched a punishing military air assault on Iraq. It was by many accounts America's biggest strategic mistake since the Vietnam War. 2 decades later, some U.S. troops are still there. But the lasting legacy may be tallied in the scores of lives lost, the trillions of dollars spent, and the damage to the U.S. reputation. CGTN's Nathan King explains.
Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict, commenced at a time of our choosing.
20 years ago, in the wake of the attacks of September 11, 2001, the US began its invasion by launching cruise missiles and laser-guided bombs against leadership targets in Baghdad. Though no weapons of mass destruction, the public rationale for the invasion were ever found, military success at first seemed swift. After toppling, then capturing President Saddam Hussein, there was little post-invasion planning. Iraqi society essentially collapsed. The US banned the former ruling Ba'ath Party and disbanded the Iraqi military, leading to an insurgency that saw US combat deaths spike and the spending of trillions of dollars. Iraqis were angry at the US. Sectarian divisions marred post-Saddam politics. Civil strife led to a crisis bordering on civil war. In December 2008, one Iraqi journalist summed up the anger of many Iraqis by throwing his shoes at then President George W. Bush. 3 US presidents later, Iraqis still remember the chaos of the US attacks.
During the war, we lived the bombing, gunfire, and explosions with fear and anxiety. We were not comfortable. The situation is now better, and we remember the days of the war, but we hope they're gone for good.
In 2008, US President Barack Obama was elected due in part to the failure of the Iraq War. He called it dumb and vowed to bring US troops home.
Let me say this as plainly as I can. By August 31st, 2010, our combat mission in Iraq will end.
But that created a vacuum quickly filled by ISIS, a radical Islamic group that moved in from Syria and conquered vast amounts of territory, even threatening Baghdad. Some US troops returned, and a bloody counterattack finally pushed ISIS back. The true death toll in Iraq may never be known. Estimates range from 100,000 to more than 1 million dead. In terms of the financial cost of the US, estimates range from $1 to $3 trillion. Money that could have been spent on roads, schools, railways, and other big, neglected projects. 20 years on, the main lesson that doesn't seem to have been learned by the US is having the world's most powerful military that you can deploy around the world at a moment's notice doesn't always yield results. And in fact, here, 20 years on, few people talk about the Iraq War. And even on this anniversary, some voices here in Washington are starting to say, well, it wasn't the disaster it was made out to be. They point to growing GDP figures in Iraq over the last 20 years and the removal of Saddam Hussein. Meanwhile, US troops still remain in the country. Nathan King, CGTN, Washington.
The U.S. is still politically divided over the war, though most say invading Iraq was a mistake. That includes U.S. military veterans. 64% of Iraq war veterans now say the war was not worth fighting. Peter Kuznick is professor of history and director of Nuclear Studies Institute at American University here in Washington. Professor, Nathan King touched on some of this already, but I just want to get your take. In your opinion, sir, what was the largest lesson learned from the Iraq War?
I would say the largest lesson is that American leaders have lied the American people into one war after another throughout our history. This has especially been the case since World War II. You look at Vietnam and the Gulf of Tonkin. You look at the invasion of Grenada in 1983, Operation Urgent Fury. Even Afghanistan, the first Gulf War was largely based upon lies. And this invasion of Iraq in 2003 was totally based upon lies. The U.S. claimed it had hard intelligence that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction, when in reality, Iraq had destroyed its weapons of mass destruction over the previous 13 years, to the point where Iraq was one of the weakest countries in the Middle East.
And Professor, beyond toppling Saddam Hussein, a leader considered a brutal, has anything good come out of that war? I mean, there are those in Washington who say Iraq is better off today than it was 20 years ago. And I know you probably do not agree with that.
Iraq may be in certain ways better off today, but Iraq is still a very, very divided, chaotic country. The poverty is still immense, suffering as a result largely of the U.S. destroying that country. America's shock and awe, as we called it, the name for our invasion, was to create the effect inside Iraq of Hiroshima and Nagasaki without the use of atomic bombs. And we did. We destroyed the infrastructure, destroyed that country, but also what it said to the world about the U.S. ability to use its force. Even before the invasion itself, when Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, was asked about the 500,000 Iraqi children who had died as a result of American sanctions, she said, "We think it's worth it." She also said, if we use force, it's because we're America. We stand taller and see farther in the future than other countries. We're the indispensable nation. These are the wrong messages. And the consequence of this, in terms of America's credibility, America's banking on the fact that people have a short memory. And we know that the American public seems to have a short memory. But this is one of the most horrific episodes of the post-war period anywhere in the world.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Professor Peter Kuznick, thank you very much. And that's it for us from here in Washington. Back to our colleagues in Beijing.
The U.S. invasion led to a tsunami of terrorist attacks in Iraq. More than 6,600 attacks were recorded in 2006, and that number declined despite a surge when ISIL was at its height. In 2020, 629 attacks were reported. It recorded roughly 560 deaths compared to more than 8,500 killed in Afghanistan, who topped the ranking. And now we want to talk to Middle East relations analyst Dr. Meir Javedenfer. Let me bring you into this, Mr. Javedenfer. Good to see you. How has the U.S. invasion of Iraq changed the country?
It has had tremendous impact on the country's security. Before, Iraq was ruled by a dictator who had a firm control over the country's security. He was a brutal dictator. He killed thousands, tens of thousands of his own people. But compared to now, one of the few good things that people could say is that there was a firm control over the country, despite all the other terrible things that he did. But now we see the country is divided, far more divided. We see that there is corruption. It's very rampant. You could say Saddam Hussein, of course, was corrupt also, but the situation now has not improved. We see that there's a civil war in Iraq. There was a civil war, but still there's a lot of animosity between the country's Kurds, between the Shias, between the Sunnis. And also because Iraq is a weaker country now in terms of central government, the neighboring countries are intervening in its affairs far more than before, which makes it even more difficult to find a solution to the country's chronic problems.
Still a deeply divided country. The country has just seen so much in the past 2 decades. Sectarian violence, terrorism, dislocation, corruption, like you mentioned. Now, weapons of mass destruction, one of the main claims the U.S. and UK used to justify the invasion, were never found in Iraq. What went wrong back then, and was it just a failure of intelligence?
That's an excellent question. The New York Times wrote an article in 2014 that said weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq by invading U.S. forces. About 4,000 ammunition, but the difference is America said that Iraq had an active WMD, weapons of mass destruction program. What America found was, yes, there was weapons of mass destruction, but they were from part of a program that had been abandoned long ago. They've been abandoned a long time ago. So that's what the Americans got wrong. I think this was at the very least, a very bad interpretation of intelligence. Since it was a much more politicized version of intelligence. I think the motivation to invade Iraq and to introduce democracy colored some of the interpretations of the intelligence. I think, whenever you politicize something, you always dilute its real value. It can be intelligence, it could be even health policy, it could be education policy. So I think it was the politicization back then of the way they saw intelligence, and they got it wrong. And I think this was one of the major lessons learned from the CIA, which they've been trying to rectify in their current work.
And how has the invasion of Iraq impacted geopolitics in the region, particularly when it comes to Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia?
For Iran, it was initially a big threat because America landed on Iran's border in 2003. And then suddenly, and this is why the Islamic Republic of Iran, according to declassified documents and various news reports, allowed some of the Al-Qaeda people to go through its soil from Afghanistan to Iraq, so they fight the Americans. and the instability in Iraq, plus the pro-Iranian Shia in Iraq, allowed Iran to have tremendous control. So first it was an absolute disaster for Iran, then it turned into a golden opportunity. For the Saudis, it's been very bad news, because prior to the invasion of Iraq was a Sunni country. Saddam Hussein, although he had his differences, great differences with the Saudi kingdom, nevertheless he was a fellow Sunni. And since Saddam Hussein was toppled and Americans tried to introduce democracy, then democracy means the rule of the majority, and the majority in Iraq are Shia. So now Iraq is run by Shia, and that's been terrible news for the Saudis. For the Turks, I would say the implications have been mainly security, because of the invasion and because of the efforts to introduce democracy. The Kurds in Iraq have had much more self-determination, and this has been viewed as a threat by the Turks, because the Turks also have their own Kurdish population, and they've been concerned that this may encourage their own Kurdish population to demand self-determination. So it has turned into a security challenge for them.
Yeah, and now looking back, the invasion in 2003 was never approved by the UN, and claims of its illegal nature fell on deaf ears. What could have done to stop it? And what lessons can be taken to prevent a similar conflict in the future?
Shuyan, I can promise you that if you had a time machine, and myself, and the best experts that you have in China, and best experts that you had in the world, we'd go back to America, we'd go back in time and tell President Bush, and it's wrong, I still don't think we would have been able to stop him. Why? Because that invasion was based more on emotions than logic. And in human beings, you and I, Chuyan, and all your viewers, our emotions are far stronger than our logic. When emotions demand something, logic is suppressed, logic is pushed aside. And President Bush was on an emotional campaign to introduce democracy in Iraq. This was his main goal. I'm not saying he didn't want oil. Of course he wanted oil also. But the biggest thing, the messianic vision, was to bring democracy to Iraq. And it's not a bad thing, I have to say, but they did it in the wrong way. And it was because of this emotional view and the emotional drive, he didn't listen to experts. And the people around him only reinforced what he believed. Well, so and we see this being repeated, emotions being suppressed. Just look at what's happening in Ukraine. President Putin invaded Ukraine. He's repeating the same mistakes for a different reason. Why? Because according from what we know, his emotions to restore greater Russia, etc., are far stronger than the logic that, if he invades, there's going to be problems. And as we can see, the results show that the logic was right, just as it was in Iraq. It's now right in Ukraine.
That's just remarkable. An emotional decision that has left a country deeply wounded till this day. Thank you very much for providing that fresh perspective and analysis. Dr. Mayor Javadin for joining me live there. Appreciate it. An attack by U.S. Apache helicopter in 2007 caused irreversible losses and immeasurable pain to a family in Iraq. It also caused American soldiers to have unpleasant memories of the whole invasion. We visited a survivor and the soldier involved in that attack.
Oh yeah, look at those dead bastards. Nice. He's getting up. If he has a weapon though in his hand? No, I haven't seen one yet. So you guys got that guy crawling right now on the curb? Yeah, I got him. I put 2 rounds near him, and you guys are shooting over there too, so.
هو كنا ببيتنا ردنا نروح البيت عمي. ابوي اول مره قال لي روح البيت عمك. جيت اطلع كان يقول لي لا اوقف. نروح سوا بالسياره. طلعنا انا وابويا واختي كلبت بينا، كان يقول روح وياكم. طلعنا رحنا البيت عمي قعدنا شويه وهذا طلعنا. المهم طلعنا طبينا بالفرع الثاني، هسه طبينا بيه ورجعنا. لقونا قدامنا جيش المهدي. شفنا عالم يعني ميته يابسه محترقه. وايرات مقطعه كهرباء. شلنا الصحف قالوا شيلوا الصحف في جيش المهدي. شلنا الصحف صعدوه هم صعدوه. ابويا بس فتح لهم الباب صعدوا الصحفي حركنا مسافه تقريبا اقل المتر ضربوا ابويا بصدره الامريكان قدامه.
Clear.
يوم ضربنا قلت لك صاروخ ضربوها طيارة ضربوا السيارة أنا ما أدري بنفسي شو نقول صواب حار حسيت بأختي دم قام ينزل من راسها كانت وصلة يمه مسحت راسها أنا ما أدري إيدي متعورة رجلي متعورة ظهري بطني كلهن ما أدري بيهن مسحت الدم من أختي 5 دقائق 6 دقائق قلت لك جو الأمريكان أخذوها طبوها ببيتي قدامنا.
At first, I didn't even realize that it was the Apaches that shot the van. The first thing I remember seeing is a group of men by a wall who had been completely decimated. They were completely shredded by these 30 millimeter shells that were hitting them. From what I saw was a protective father. There was no reason to kill that man. And I didn't want to even look at it, but then I heard a little girl crying coming from the van. I remember her eyes being so ghostly white because of the blood around them, and nobody in my unit was helping her. Nobody. They were running away from the van. And I had a daughter at the time who was pretty close to the same age as her. I saw my own children. There was no difference in that child and my own. And so I immediately, without even thinking about it, I scooped her up and I took her into the house behind where the van was shot. There was a guy in there hiding in his kitchen from the shooting, and I asked him to get some water, and he brought in a bucket of water, and that's when I was cleaning the little girl off, and this little girl's crying, she's hurt. You know, I take my gloves off and I'm picking out the glass that's in her eyes, because every time she blinks, it's cutting her eyes more. And I kept thinking to myself, I'm like, what are we doing? These are babies. And I looked in through the driver's side of the van, and that's when I saw the little boy take like a exasperated, like a labored breath, like, and then come back, and it shocked me. I just started screaming out, the boy's alive, the boy's alive. And I run over to him and I scoop him up, and I'm cradling him, and I look down at the boy and I'm saying, don't die, I've got you, you're gonna be okay. And hold on. I feel used. I feel used for being in Iraq. Like, you caused a lot of destruction of people. I think the numbers are somewhere pretty close to 1 million Iraqis were killed in the Iraq War. That's astronomical. I can't even imagine that amount of people.
This is him now.
Oh, wow. Could you send me this picture? Oh my God.
شكرا شكرا طبعا لأن نقذنا ونقذ أختي. شعور مؤلم، يعني تعيد ذكرياتك، انت ابوك مات قدامك، صدمة يعني كبيرة.
And then when I joined the military in basic training, they had this way of telling you that if you didn't kill the Muslims, that somehow they were going to miraculously show up in your living room and kill your kids. And for the brainwashing part, that works. We should have never been there. You can't tell somebody how to live their life and how to be and to change everything about them by force. You can't provide freedom and democracy through the barrel of a gun. It just doesn't happen.
And many of the U.S. allies played a role in the invasion, and Britain was one of them. Though hundreds of thousands have protested the UK's involvement, the then Prime Minister Tony Blair did not change his course. And for more on this, my colleague Jamie Owen is joining us from London. Jamie.
The UK was a key ally of the United States in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, but the decision by the then Prime Minister Tony Blair was met with widespread opposition, not just by large sections of the British public, but also by the families of some of the soldiers. 20 years on, our correspondent Shamim Chowdhury has been finding out why so many are still so angry.
Corporal Stephen Albert was killed by friendly fire near the southern city of Basra just days into the Iraq War. A 2007 inquest found he died due to negligence by the British Army. His widow Debbie spent the next 14 years seeking justice.
The Defence Secretary at the time claimed national security, which meant that I couldn't take it any further. I couldn't get it into our court, which is what I wanted. Because there was no appeals procedure or anything like that. I was just absolutely heartbroken. I was angry. I felt that I hadn't achieved all my goals that I wanted to do, because I promised Steve that I would get justice and make sure it wouldn't happen again. And it was just stopped in an instant.
Debbie is among several families of British soldiers who took legal action against the army. They not only objected to the treatment of troops, but to the war itself. Their views were shared by millions across the country. Hundreds of thousands of people protested Britain's involvement in Iraq. But Prime Minister Tony Blair remained resolute.
This is not the time to falter. This is the time for this House, not just this government or indeed this Prime Minister, but for this House to give a lead. To show that we will stand up for what we know to be right.
Some even demanded he be tried for war crimes, accusing him of letting British soldiers and Iraqi civilians die in vain.
This memorial honours the 179 British soldiers who lost their lives in Iraq. But the human casualties aren't the only price of war. The 8-year conflict cost the UK nearly $12 billion, paid for by British taxpayers.
In 2016, an official investigation into the war, known as the Chilcot Inquiry, found that Iraq's leader Saddam Hussein did not pose a threat to Britain at the time of the invasion, and that evidence of him possessing weapons of mass destruction was not conclusive. Tony Blair rejected the criticism of his decision, and while he apologised for mistakes, he continued to justify the invasion, saying removing Saddam from power had been the right thing to do. But for Debbie's two young sons, Joshua and Connor, the war has meant growing up without a father.
They had a lot of problems. They were behind at school. They had a lot of anger issues. They were privy to information that they shouldn't have been privy to.
Just a few of the tens of thousands of British lives impacted by the country's involvement in Iraq. Shamim Chowdhury, CGTN, London.
Claire Short was the UK's International Development Secretary, a member of the UK government during the lead-up to the Iraq War, and was there as the political and legal case was set out. She had clearly stated misgivings about what was about to happen, but she stayed on in government, hoping to shape events after the invasion, a move that perhaps ultimately cost her her job. She resigned from the government and eventually left the Labour Party. Claire Short, welcome. You first reluctantly supported UK Prime Minister Tony Blair and the invasion of Iraq. Why did you support it?
I never did support, well, like everyone else, if we went through the UN, because you remember there was the question of the WMD and weapons inspectors, and they'd been driven out, getting them back in, getting all back onto legality, getting the UN back in, getting the sanctions lifted, which was really hurting the Iraqi people. So I was in favour of something to resolve it. And of course, Blair kept contradicting himself. Yes, we're going through the UN, I would support that. And then we get Hans Blix back to inspect. Then he starts to doubt there is anything, then they attack him.
He's the weapons inspector.
Yes, sorry. So I was in favour of sticking through a UN process and doing something that prioritised the interests of the people of Iraq and getting the sanctions lifted. And Blair was not honest with the people of Britain or his government, indeed.
You had a ringside seat. You were there in the cabinet room in this long march to war. Tony Blair was aware of your misgivings and was trying to keep you in the cabinet. What are your memories of those talks with Tony Blair?
Well, I mean, the first thing is the question of whether there's legal authority. One of the UK legal officers in the Foreign Office resigned, saying there's no legal authority for war without the UN approval. And then rumours were going around Whitehall saying our soldiers said they wouldn't go without legal authority because they'd be subject to the International Criminal Court. And then rumours that the Attorney General said there wasn't legal authority. And then right at the last minute, we got an abbreviated account of the legal advice saying there was no problem at all. So it's stuff like that, because I'm hanging on thinking, well, if there's no legal authority, we won't go. And my big thing was, I mean, America didn't need British soldiers. They just needed an ally, because most of the world was against it. So Britain was a token. And my view was, if we could hold on to Tony, we might even delay the invasion and get American policy to put the interests of the people of Iraq first, rather than hubris and trying to show what a big, strong power they were, because they were so angry about September the 11th, the attack on the Twin Towers.
And did no one around the cabinet table in the UK, in this march to war, consider what would happen after the invasion? Was there no debate, no consideration of what happens next, a plan?
Very little. I mean, the truth is, the Americans were leading and Britain was just joining in. So obviously America, and you know, famously Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense in America, said, we don't do nation building. They made no plan. They believed in their propaganda. They believed, because Saddam Hussein was a very cruel ruler and not popular with the people of Iraq. So they thought the people would welcome them and then they could just, you know, carry on with their lives and there wouldn't be any trouble. It was an utterly irresponsible lack of planning. And in fact, for the British troops, we told them from the Department of International Development just before the date, you'll be an occupying power, you'll have a responsibility to make sure people are fed and looked after. And they started ordering food at the last minute. There was no planned preparation, and no, it wasn't raised around the cabinet table. The issue was whether we should be in it or not with the Americans, but everyone knew the Americans were leading.
So 20 years on, how do you remember the Iraq War?
I remember the Iraq War as a terrible mistake, and that the government, Tony Blair really individually, only got people's support by being untruthful about why he was doing it and whether there was WMD and what had happened at the UN. There was even dishonesty about that, pretending that they had UN authority when they didn't. So lies, breaches of international law, terrible destruction, brought shame on the government, diminished its reputation, alienated me from my party. The only thing to do now is learn lessons and try and bring peace and development to the people of Iraq who've suffered terribly.
Claire Short, thank you very much. Back to you in Beijing.
Data released by the UN Refugee Agency shows as of December 2022, 1.2 million Iraqis remain internally displaced since January 2014, while 5 million internally displaced persons or IDPs have returned home or been resettled in new communities. Of all Iraq's IDPs, 76% live in urban areas. 15% live in the 26 IDP camps across the country, 25 of which are managed by the UN Refugee Agency, while the remaining 9% live in critical shelters. Governorates in federal Iraq host nearly 5,000 IDPs in camps, and the Kurdistan region of Iraq hosts 175,000 IDPs in camps. As an impartial, neutral, and independent organization, the International Committee of the Red Cross in Iraq has helped displaced people, refugees, and civilians in places affected by fighting during the times of crisis with emergency assistance. And for more on the ICRC's efforts in Iraq, we're pleased to be joined by Sarah Al-Zakwari, Communication Manager from the Baghdad delegation of the ICRC in Iraq. Great to have you with us, Sarah. Now, the ICRC has been carrying out humanitarian activities in Iraq since 1980. Tell us more about ICRC's work in Iraq in recent years.
Thank you very much for having us. That's true. We've been working in Iraq for many years, trying our best to reduce the suffering of the people and help them adapt through these very tough conditions. Now, for more than 40 years, Iraqis have gone through wars, sanctions, terror acts, sectarian violence, amongst many other turbulences. And throughout these rounds of conflict, this has left behind hundreds of thousands of missing people. We don't think there is a family in Iraq that doesn't have a missing loved one. And they have suffered terribly, not knowing answers, not knowing the fate of the people that they've missed. And now with the ICRC, we're working very hard with these families that have been struggling, helping them with trying to find answers for...
Sarah, it seems we have lost your connection there. We'll try to get back to our guest, Sarah, there in just a moment once we fix anything. For years, international organizations have been working hard on reconstructing Iraq's infrastructure. And my colleague Liu Xin spoke to UNESCO's representative to Iraq. Take a listen.
Tell us a little bit what the UNESCO is focusing on right now. What have you been busy trying to achieve in Iraq?
Well, in the last few years, we've been working a lot on post-conflict reconstruction. There has been a lot of focus, particularly on education and culture. Of course, education has also been focusing on out-of-school children, focusing on bringing back those who have lost an opportunity on education. A lot of reconstruction of schools. And for what it concerns our work, our flagship initiative has been the one on reviving the spirit of Mosul, which is focusing really on the idea that Mosul was a city that for many millennia has been a center of exchanges, a center of intercultural dialogue, and that all of a sudden was the epicenter of drama and destruction and conflict. So the idea from the Director General of UNESCO was to make Mosul a symbol of renaissance of the entire Iraq, but also probably of the region that has been devastated by the conflict. So since 2019, I'm in the country, and we've built a team in order to work hard on the reconstruction of the old historical city center of Mosul. It is, of course, this is the largest program that UNESCO has in the world for the last many decades, I think. So we have a team of people working in Mosul, trying to build both historical monuments, such as the Al-Nuri Mosque and Al-Sa and Al-Tahir Church, and also bringing back some heritage houses in order to rebuild a little bit the idea of a city center. And I just want to add one last element. I mean, the entire idea of reconstructing is not really about bricks, it's not really about stones, it's mostly about the people. That is why about reviving the spirit of Mosul. It is the idea of bringing back cultural identity and cultural diversity as an element of bringing back peace and reconciliation in the city, making it a symbol for Iraq. And also there's another element, which is the one of economic development. So we are using culture and heritage in order to create jobs, employments, and revive also the economic fabric of a city.
The decision to overthrow the regime of Saddam Hussein caused a chain of events that are still playing out to this day. Based on a poll conducted by CGTN, over 93% of respondents believe that the U.S. should account for the war crimes it committed in Iraq. Over 94% of respondents believe that there was no legitimacy for the U.S. to launch a war in Iraq. And the poll saw over 80,000 people respond within 24 hours. Let's get more insight onto this. Professor Wang Jin is joining me now from Xi'an. He's a specialist in Middle Eastern studies at China's Northwest University. Thank you for joining us, Professor. So this recent CGTN poll shows that over 93% of respondents say that the United States should be held accountable for its war crimes in Iraq. 94% of respondents also believe that the U.S. had no legitimacy to launch the invasion. What do those findings tell you?
I think it means that the United States should continue to be responsible for the disasters, the crisis, and the problem inside Iraq, as well as the other countries that intervened by the United States. Because what we have to know that the United States, what we are seeing the problems in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, and other Middle Eastern countries that is still suffering from the crisis. that these crises are largely resulted from United States interventions, are largely from United States invasions, and largely resulted from United States occupations, although some of the countries the United States has already declared that they withdrawn from. But we have to know that this withdrawal just occurred not long ago, and United States military presence and political dominance there lasted for 2 decades or even maybe longer. So today is the problem there. The United States should be responsible. Some of the humanitarian disasters, some of the social development problems, some of the political divisions, United States should be the #1 responsible state for this disaster. The United States should do more to help the people, not just to leave away, just as what they are saying, not just the words that they promised with the empty words. They should do more. Julian.
Let's also talk about the state of the Iraqi economy, Professor. Iraq is the second largest crude oil producer in OPEC, right after Saudi Arabia, and has the world's 5th largest crude oil reserves. And in 2019, about 90% of Iraq's revenue came from oil production. But between 2002 and 2021, the country's GDP per capita in purchasing power parity was up by only $200, according to the World Bank. And as we've just heard, some in Washington suggest that the invasion was not a total blunder, citing economic growth. What were the concrete benefits, if any, that Iraq enjoyed post-war?
I think maybe there were some of the economic development inside Iraq. We have to admit, if we look at the data, if we look at the figure, of course there was some economic growth, especially what we are talking about economic growth in the past 2 decades. If there was totally no economic growth, I think we can call it a problem itself. But we have to know that Iraq, on the one hand, as you say, it's a very, very country with very rich crude oil, with the rich natural resources. So it is a country that should have the potential to develop itself and should have the country to pave the way for its own social and cultural model rather than the intervention of the other countries. And on the other hand, we have to know that Iraq's economic development, as many other developing countries, are resulted from the technology developments, technology updates, and also as what is happening now the rest of the world. So Iraq itself has the potential, has the capability to develop itself. But the United States interventions, what the United States did, just interrupted the pace of the development of the Iraqi people, and also give the new unrest and the new problem into the country. So that is why we call it, what we say that, okay, United States, what their interventions maybe leads to to some extent economic growth, but this is not all. The Iraqi people, they should develop much better, but the United States intervention changed everything. Julian.
Professor, very recently, Iraq's central bank RMB settlement agreement will allow trade with China to be settled directly in the Chinese yuan. And China is Iraq's largest trading partner, and Iraq is China's 3rd largest trading partner among the Arab nations. How will this agreement further boost bilateral economic and trade relations? How significant is this move?
I think this move is very, very historic, because on the one hand, when we're talking about the settlement of the agreement to launch the business with one state national currency, it means the confidence about this state's economic development future. For example, the Iraqi use the settlements of the yuan, renminbi. It shows that Iraqi people, the Iraq government, the confidence about China's development, about Chinese success in the future. So this is a very, very important sign of confidence. And on the other hand, when we're talking about the use the renminbi directly between the two countries, it means that it will create more and more opportunities for the bilateral cooperation in the future, because it will give the convenience to the bilateral businessman. It will pave the way for new opportunities of the bilateral cooperation in different fields. So that is why we call it a very historic moment, and also it will bring the more and more brighter future for the bilateral cooperations.
And Professor, in relation to Iraq's post-war reconstruction, let's talk about this. What are the most pressing concerns? What are the main challenges? What's the future prospect of this? How are you looking at it?
I think the most needed thing to do is to reconstruct and rebuild infrastructure for the Iraqi people. But because after the 2 decades of the United States intervention, and also after years of the local extremism and terrorism, the warfare, the problem is that for the Iraqi people is the lack of the infrastructure, such as electricity, running water, roads, and a lot of the infrastructure. So that is why every people, they need the better living standards, the better social living, so they want the better lives. But without enough supporting of the infrastructure, this will become the big problem for the ordinary Iraqi people. And on the other hand, we have to know that without the political stable government and the political stability in this country, it means that if we want to rebuild the infrastructure in the country, it will become a big problem, because as we just mentioned, our colleagues before me, as we can see that inside Iraq, there are more and more divisions between sectarians, between political parties. So without stability, it means that it is very difficult to reconstruct the country through the infrastructure. Without this infrastructure, it will become a big obstacle for the future economic development and social development. Juliet.
Thank you very much for your insights. Professor Wang Jin joining me live from Xi'an. Thank you very much. I want to bring back Sarah Al-Zakwari, communications manager from the Baghdad delegation of the ICRC in Iraq, to talk about the refugee situation there in Iraq. She is joining us on the phone this time. Sarah, good to have you back. Now, earlier you were telling us ICRC's work in Iraq. Tell us more about the situation, the humanitarian situation in Iraq right now, and what's the best way to deal with the large numbers of internally displaced persons and refugees?
So Iraq is considered one of the most heavily contaminated countries in the world, with over 3,000 kilometers of its lands considered not safe due to remnants of war, which include mortars, rockets, shells, mines, unexploded devices that are left behind. And with each year, large numbers of civilians are killed and injured, while others haven't been able to go back home or farm their land. So in addition to all of this, it's estimated that we have 1.2 million Iraqis remain internally displaced, while around 5 million have returned either to their place of origin or face secondary displacement. The humanitarian concerns are definitely huge, and there are many external factors that are also adding additional layers to the struggles of the people. And as you can see right now, climate change is one of them. Iraq is known to be one of the 5th most vulnerable countries in the world. Very high temperatures are becoming more common. We see droughts more frequent and dust storms more intense. Not to even mention, like, desertification affects 39% of Iraq's territory. So in addition to all the direct consequences of war, drought and water scarcity has also led many people to be displaced. Now families are finding it very difficult to meet their basic needs, and this is where we have been trying very hard to help those displaced and returnees, because their numbers are huge and they're all over the country. And the way that we've been working is in a multidisciplinary approach to help them return safely to their areas. Through durable return programs, rebuilding their lives, rebuild their homes, schools, having them access water and electricity, and so on.
And Sarah, what's your take on the challenges ahead in helping rebuilding the nation?
I think although large-scale military operations are largely over in Iraq and more attention has been given to recovery and reconstruction efforts, millions of people across Iraq remain in need of humanitarian assistance. And the progress on reconstruction and development has been very slow, meaning if we go to many of the places in the country, you will find the infrastructure remains damaged or destroyed and very deteriorated. It's also very clear that the humanitarian funding has decreased, and for places like Iraq, it would be crucial for the international community not to forget the people who are still struggling for the consequences of the wars. And on the contrary, now is usually the best time to support such communities to have a bigger impact. So the needs are huge, and there's so much to do in order to help people adapt and recover.
Sarah, we appreciate you and your team's work there in Iraq. Thank you for taking the time talking to us. That's Sarah Al-Zakwari joining me live from Mosul. And as a result, Iraq's second largest city, Mosul, has been severely impacted. But since the city's liberation in 2017, a local orchestra has been inspiring the belief that music can heal wounds. Let's take a look at the country's gradual recovery 20 years on.
يعني احنا متعودين انه من حرب الى حرب يعني هذه حياتنا كانت من حرب الى حرب. انا سمعت تصريح لاوباما في وقتها يمكن انه ازمه داعش ستستمر من 3 إلى 5 سنوات. يعني تحتاج المدينه بعد ان تنهض. في تلك الفتره بداوا باعتقال هاي المجموعه اللي بقينا احنا. ايضا اللي وضعتها بعض المؤلفات وضعتها يعني ضربات اللي كنت استخدمها بالآلات الموسيقية وبالأدرامز هذه يعني كانت كأنه الصدمات اللي كنا نعاني منها، الحروب، الدمار.
I feel that was very nice and good memories and I am proud of telling them, but at the time it was not easy. You have to be careful. The neighbors will not hear you. Because if anybody heard you, that will be my killing. Definitely, that's a good reason for them, according to them. Yeah. So we were very careful every day end, just to hide the tools between the ceiling and the false roof. At that area, I was having a place to hide them, in case if they come by chance and see it. It was not easy. It is a matter of your life in a single moment.
1 60 هذا بروش وهذا بروش ما بيناتهم ويصعد في هذا.
In the desert for our special program on the fallout of the Iraq War. 20 years on, we've looked back on the conflict and its impact on Iraqis today. I'm Lucia in Beijing. Thank you so much for watching. Up next, The World Today with Mama Meng. Stay tuned.